My name is Art Cohen, and I'm from Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. Well, during the time that I was playing with Ministry of Inside Things, we often shared the stage with Orbital Decay, and Terry and Scott and Orbital Decay have been part of the scene for forever. And so I got to know those guys, and I also looked around and saw that a very common lineup for a space music band is a synthesizer, keyboard player, and a guitarist, like the Ministry of Inside Things, Orbital Decay, the Tangent Project, any number of groups. That's how they play. Or sometimes there's two synth players and a guitarist, like Radio Massacre International does it that way. And I thought, well, what if we eliminate the keyboard player and just what about if we did it with just the guitar players? And how would that sound? And how could we do that? And what kind of music would we play? And I've been thinking about that for several years, and I mentioned it to Scott Watkins from Orbital Decay, and he said, "Oh, that would be cool." And eventually, I got off my duff and made the calls and set it up and had a jam with Scott. And I would say my original intent was actually to have 3 guitar players. But when I initially jammed with Scott, I realized that, at least for now, initially, the problem was not that we were too thin and didn't have enough going on. The problem was there was too many layers. It was too thick. There was too much going on, even with just the 2 of us, because using echoes and loops, and Scott plays a more complex setup using guitar synth and some other things, so he can often have 3 or 4 different sounds coming out at the same time, even though he's just playing on a guitar. So we decided, okay, I'll just do this with Scott, and we'll try to simplify the sound a little bit and make it work. Another thing that was really attracted me to want to do Guitar Pilots with Scott was he had built a Beam. And I was familiar with the Beam through the Grateful Dead, because Mickey Hart of the Grateful Dead had a Beam built and played it in concert for many years throughout the 80s and 90s when the Grateful Dead were still around. And so I'd been exposed to that sound, and the Beam is just it's an otherworldly instrument because it's large, it's got long strings, you can get some super low notes, they vibrate in a way that beyond what you can get with a guitar or other more conventional stringed instrument. And you can get some textures that would be very difficult to create on a synthesizer, just some very harmonically complex vibrations of the string. So when I saw that Scott had built his Beam and I heard him play it, I was like, oh, well, we definitely need to incorporate this as well. And coincidentally, around the same time, I had designed a Beam, which my friend Roland built. And so I had some experience with Beam as well. But let me describe what a Beam is. It's literally a beam. In other words, a long, not that thick or wide object, like a beam that you'd build a building out of, usually made out of metal, but it could be made out of anything that you choose to make it out of. And you string a bunch of strings between 2 anchor points across the length of the beam. There's no fixed number of strings. There's no fixed size that the beam would need to be, although generally the longer the better. And then the sound is usually picked up using a magnetic coil pickup, similar to a guitar pickup, sometimes literally a guitar pickup, depending on what you build. So it's basically, you could think of a beam as being a gigantic lap steel guitar, because it's basically the same thing, which is it's a dense object that's long that you string the strings over so they can vibrate. They're picked up electromagnetically, and usually the beam is tuned to where the string, there's not a whole lot of different pitches. You could sometimes tune all the strings to the same pitch. Sometimes you'll pick a couple of different pitches and have a couple of different sizes of strings, but it's not generally tuned like a guitar where every note is a different pitch. That doesn't work too well to do that. More specifically, the beam that Scott built is a 12-foot long box cross-section piece of aluminum. And I believe the distance between the two bridges is about 10 feet because you need room at either end to anchor. Usually the tuning pegs are like on a piano, but again, there's no rules. I should point out that you can't go to your local guitar shop and buy a beam. You guys remember, you can't go to any music store and buy a beam. They're not commercially manufactured by anybody. So everyone that plays a beam either built it themselves or had somebody build it for them. And therefore they're all different because so there's many different designs. So the beam Scott built is a 12-foot long piece, and I have a beam which I didn't build but I designed, and my friend Roland built it. And it's a little different in that the beam is a piece of wood. It's a 8-foot long, 6-inch by 6-inch cross section piece of red oak. So it's a dense, nicely resonating piece of hardwood. On that beam, I put in 2 sets of pickups. They're actually dual-bladed humbucking Stratocaster type pickups made by DiMarzio. And this beam that I designed has 8 strings, so each pickup picks up 4 strings, and they're in 2 pairs. One near one of the bridges, and the other one at the nodal point where the second octave harmonic would be, which is sort of where the neck pickup would traditionally go on a guitar, for those who know about those things. Scott's beam uses actually an electric bass pickup, and it has 21 strings, and the pickup is actually movable on his beam. It's not fixed, it just rests there, so he can move it around to different spots. And he also has alternate bridges, again, pieces of aluminum, so he can change the tuning or put the whole thing in a different key simply by putting an alternate bridge in and changing the string length, which in Guitar Pilots music, we have the beam is tuned to E, the key of E, and it's most of the strings are E, as some strings are a B and the rest of them are an E, so those are both notes that are very firmly in the key of E. And then we have another piece that's in C, and so Scott puts in the alternate bridge at appropriate place, and then when we're playing beam in the other piece, it's now in the right key, in the key of C. And the output of the pickups is just like, actually both Scott's beam and mine are it's passive output, so there's not active electronics in the beam itself, but it's played through a multi-effects unit that's designed for a guitar, because usually beam sounds more interesting when it has some echo, reverb, maybe some other effects applied to it. Kind of adds enhancement and interest to the sound. And the ways of playing the beam are varied. You can pluck the strings. You can bow the strings in a glissando fashion usually play with a piece of metal. You can move a piece of metal back and forth. You can bang on the strings with a piece of metal. Mickey Hart did that. He played it like a percussion instrument sometimes. You can also, of course, move an object lengthwise up and down the strings while it's sounding, and so the pitch is changing on all the strings as you're sounding it. There's also some techniques that involve using the palm of your hand on the strings and brushing them lightly, and you get some other textures. And I know Scott does that sometimes with Guitar Pilots. I've also seen Mickey Hart do that very similar technique. Scott sometimes plays the beam with a violin bow, which has a whole other range of harmonics and textures. And I'm probably leaving out a few other... Oh, there's another thing with putting a metal rod on the beam and tapping on the strings while the rod is rolling along the strings, which again has its own unique sound, and Scott does that. So there's no rules. That's one interesting thing about the beam as an instrument is Well, it fundamentally has a unique sound because the strings are so long. Just like in pianos, like the best concert grand pianos are 10-foot long concert grands, but you only get to see them in a concert hall because most people can't fit a 10-foot grand piano in their house. Well, but they have the lower notes, especially on a 10-foot grand piano, just have a big, huge sound. Well, a beam is capable of a big, huge sound because the strings are long. And something that I learned about that was counterintuitive was that you don't actually tune the strings very tightly. I had originally thought it should be like a piano with the strings very taut, and on the beam I designed, we actually use piano strings. But what I found is that when you make the strings looser, they actually are able to vibrate more and get some more interesting twangy, pointy, just a range, there's a more interesting range of textures that you can get. So the strings don't have to be really tight. But again, there's no rule. If you choose to make your strings tight on a beam and you figure out how you want to play it and what sounds you want to get, there's no rules, and that makes it particularly interesting. Well, when Scott and I put together the duo of playing space music with guitars, we were kicking around many different names, and then Guitar Pilots came up, and that seemed like that was the right name. And the reason is because one part of the whole point of the group is guitars, the fact that we're playing on guitars, and so having that right in the name makes that pretty obvious. And the Pilots suggests how the music is used, that it's space music, that it is journeying and traveling music. And since we're the ones playing the guitars, we are the guitar pilots because we pilot the guitar. So we're driving the spaceship with our guitars. It's basically what it is. And that's why we call it Guitar Pilots. And one reason for doing Guitar Pilots is because I didn't see anybody else doing that. And so I thought it was a void that needed to be filled. I love playing the guitar. I like the fact that you're touching the strings. That's the thing that's different about a guitar versus synthesizer. You know, I do play keyboards. I do play synthesizers. I've used them in studio recordings and other situations. But I really love performing on a guitar because my fingers are touching the strings and it's so immediate. And Scott, Scott and I have, when we besides getting together to play music, we discuss music. And actually, leading up to the formation of Guitar Pilots, we had many long hours of discussion about music, and we found that we had a lot of common ground. Other guitarists that we respected and emulated, music that we loved to listen to, and approaches to playing that we shared in common. So it just seemed a natural fit that we should play some music together because we had so much in common. And even though the basic structure of the music is consistent with what is often done in the genre of space music, and the usual influences. However, the actual sound of what we do is, I think it's somewhat unique because we do it with guitars, and even though there is synth, it's kind of used in a different way, and there's no keyboards. I would say that besides the sound of an instrument, the way you play an instrument affects what you play on an instrument. So playing the same sound on a guitar synthesizer is going to come out sounding different than if you played it on the same patch but played from a keyboard. Just things get articulated in different ways. And I thought it would be interesting to make some space music where the articulations are all what you get when you're hitting strings, as opposed to pressing keys. And I won't say we don't turn knobs because we do some knob turning as well, but it all starts with strings vibrating. Well, the thing that I like about David Gilmour is I like his economy and his taste as well as, of course, his technical skills. But unlike most of the other guitarists that are considered in the pantheon of great guitar players, he's not a flash player. Most of what you hear from him is actually played fairly slow and deliberate. But he gets beautiful tones that are just right for the piece, and puts them in just the right place to get the point across and to make the music work. And actually, Pink Floyd music in the David Gilmour era of Pink Floyd, which is all but the very beginning, is pretty much like that. It's economical, and yet everything is just in the right place. Even, and that's why I'm very impressed, even when they're improvising, even when they're playing pieces where the notes aren't the same, the pieces don't go exactly the same way every time they play them, still, David Gilmour, you never hear anything out of place. And he's and just has a sense of tone and a sense of where to play it and what to play that's just beautiful. And that's why I'm a big fan of David Gilmour. That's why I like his guitar playing. Jimi Hendrix, he was a revelation to me when I first became aware of his music. This is before I actually got serious about playing guitar. I became acquainted with Jimi Hendrix's music, and he took the guitar to such a different level and it wasn't about the technique of playing fast and that, which of course he could do. The level that he took it to that really impressed me was incorporating noise, incorporating the buzzes and the hums and the squeals and the feedback into his playing and making it musical and making it feel organic. And like the electric guitar with all of its warts and all of its noises was an extension of his brain, an extension of his mind, an extension of his feeling. And that was a really powerful thing that affected me deeply. I remember, this is before I said I got serious about playing guitar. I would sing songs and hum songs. I would try to sing and hum the Jimi Hendrix electric guitar parts, and I would make all these weird noises with my mouth, emulating Jimi Hendrix. And then when I got into playing guitar, of course, as he's old for any electric guitar, certainly of my generation, he's just a touchstone. All his techniques and sounds, and another thing about him is that nobody, even people that consciously tried really hard to imitate him, nobody sounds like him. It was always him, and it wasn't the gear too. There's recordings of him playing an acoustic guitar. It still sounds like Jimi Hendrix. And I thought that was something to emulate, is to always be oneself and have a unique voice. Well, Jerry Garcia is probably my biggest influence as a guitar player, and also as a musician in many ways. The music of the Grateful Dead, which is largely informed by Jerry Garcia's approach, and the thing about Garcia is he was coming from a place of folk music, and I also come from a place of folk music. Folk music is music that I listened to when I was a kid because my parents were into it and I was exposed to it as a young age. Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Lead Belly and that sort of thing. And Garcia listened to and was influenced and played those songs early in his career. And then he took it to a whole nother level with the Grateful Dead, amplified. But his guitar style is almost the complete opposite of Jimi Hendrix, in that Garcia mainly plays a clean sound. So he uses the electricity just mostly to make it louder and somewhat affect the texture, but he's not a big distortion and noise player. That's mostly rare. He doesn't do that very often, or didn't do that very often, I should say. And for me, it was a natural fit when I became exposed to the music of the Grateful Dead, because it was coming out of folk music, and that was a comfortable place for me. But of course, the other thing about Grateful Dead music and Jerry Garcia's music is the explorative aspect of it and the improvisational aspect of it, where you have music where it's okay to go with the flow, to use a tired phrase, and to spontaneously play the music as you're feeling it right in that moment, and to be right in that moment, listening to the other musicians and responding to them, and also leading them in another direction, to be able to take a piece of music, say a particular song, jam it out, improvising on the song, and then morph it into something else that's not even a song, and maybe eventually morph it into a completely different song. And the Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia showed me the way to do that. Also, of course, the experience of going to Grateful Dead concerts is a unique experience. And for those who have been, then and for those who haven't been, you'll never know. I hate to say that, but and that's really about the moment. It's all about the moment, and I think that's the biggest lesson that I learned from that music and from Jerry Garcia is music is a series of moments, and when you can just be deep into each one and appreciate it for what it is, there's a certain transcendence that happens, that you get beyond time and space, and you're just suspended in that particular moment, and then you move on to the next one and go where it may. Well, first of all, it's a form of instrumental music. It's even though voices are sometimes used, there's rarely do you have actual words in the music. And when you do, it's usually a small element of. So it's definitely not structured as songs in the conventional way of a popular or art song or anything like that. But even compared to other forms of instrumental music, say symphonic music for one, a big difference in space music is that the real element that's manipulated, that where the action is in space music, is really all in the textures and the timbres. And that's really, I think, the new thing, because this music came out of when synthesizers were invented and developed and became widely available to musicians, which really only happened within the last 50 years or so. Some musicians said, we have access to all these different timbres, we can make these different textures, and they started playing music where that was what was key, and that some of the elements that might be the important elements in other forms of music, say the harmonies, like symphonic music often has some, is often harmonically complex or melodically complex. There's other music where it's very emphasized on the rhythm. There's rhythmic complexity. Whereas in space music, generally there's less complexity in rhythm and harmony, but there's way more complexity and way more variation in the timbre, and the story is often told with the timbres, to the point where there's places where it doesn't even matter what note you're playing, it just matters what the sound is that you're playing that note in. Or maybe it's not even a note, because sometimes the music doesn't have a pitch that's defined, it's just a sound, and that's okay too. But a difference between some more experimental musics, for instance, where it's all about an adventure of different sounds, and it's all that is that in space music there is a narrative, there is a conscious flow. It's not just an assemblage of bizarre sounds, although there could be a section where it does that, but the whole piece generally doesn't do that. If it's good space music, it actually has a feeling of going on a journey. It has a feeling of a defined beginning and end, and things that happen in the middle, or different adventures along the way. But but those things are defined more by the sounds and less by the pitches and the harmonies and even the rhythms. Well, I think to space music, more so than many other kinds of music, what the listener gets out of it depends on what they put into it. And what that means is that space music can work as background music, in which case the listener isn't really actively listening at all, and there's just some sounds, and it creates like ambient music. In other words, it creates a sonic atmosphere that just is there while something else is going on, or while they're thinking about something else. But if the listener is actively listening, then they're bringing something else, because it becomes a soundtrack for their own narrative and their own journey, and they're responding to it that way. And so that affects what the music means because of what they're thinking about as it's happening. And then there's another level in the live performance, and I should point out that the vast majority of space music does not get performed live, that only exists as something that somebody made in a studio and gets on a CD and people listen to it privately. But when it is performed live, that the fact of having active listeners in the room that the musicians are aware are actively listening affects how they play. I know I'll speak for myself. It affects how I play, knowing that there's people listening and paying attention and hanging on each moment, and that there's a certain magic. I can't even explain it any other way. It's when a bunch of people are actively engaged in the same thing, in something together, it becomes more than just the individuals. There's some collective thing that happens, and at a space music concert, that absolutely can happen in a concrete way, because the music is fluid, and you said there's improvisation. The music isn't always played exactly the same way, so that the feeling that's in the room, because of the people that are in the room and how they're listening and what exactly is going on, affects how I play and affects how the music comes out. So there's a feedback loop that if I'm feeling the vibe, I hate to use these terms, it just sounds so whatever, but I don't have better words to describe what it is. If I'm feeling the energy and the vibe in the room because of the people and how they're responding to my music, then I'll play it with more intensity, or I'll take it maybe in a little different place. And similarly, I've had the experience of playing space music in a less than ideal environment, and that's it's hard to do. It's a struggle sometimes to play when I know that the people are actively not listening and not caring, and it's not a situation where, well, it's just supposed to be, I was prepared for a concert, not for just to be the background music, and then they're treating it like the background music. I find personally, I have either two reactions. Either it's just a struggle, and I just try to get through the set competently, and often end up playing shorter, more terse versions of the pieces, or sometimes I get angry and I express that musically, and I go like, well, I'll show you. Okay, you're not listening anyway, and I'll play more aggressively and weirder and louder, and just because I'm responding to that. And that's sometimes interesting. Sometimes the recordings come out kind of interesting, but it's really more satisfying when the audience is tuned in. At places like the Gatherings concert series, for instance, which is a wonderful place to play space music and to listen to space music, because there you have a beautiful room with beautiful acoustics, an audience that's well versed in the genre, that sits quietly and listens, and oftentimes there's lights or projections or other things that enhance the mood, and so all those elements come together to make the experience for the listener, but also for the musicians, and it becomes a feedback loop of just making everybody higher, just bringing everybody to a higher plane, and having a fulfilling experience.